For joining us for our webinar today. This is a webinar on valuing environmental catastrophes. I want to thank you for visiting with us. A few things about the webinar. We've got three great speakers today. I'll introduce them in just a second. We're going to go through three presentations from each of them. Each presentation will be 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes to maybe a half hour at the end to have some discussion. And so keep any questions you have, or I should say, ask any questions you have at any point. If you want to do that, we've got everyone muted, but you can use the Q&A feature or the chat feature. Either one will work fine. Just go ahead and put any question you have as you're listening into the Q&A or the chat. The speakers from time to time might be able to answer the Q&A questions or the chat questions as they're watching those come across, but we also might wait till the end. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put those into the Q&A or the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Appreciate our speakers for joining us today. We have three distinguished speakers. All of them have good ties here to the state of Ohio, although one of them currently isn't in the state of Ohio. So the first speaker up today is going to be Tim Haab, the professor and chair of the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University. He's an expert in valuation of recreation and other non-market resources and co-authored the highly influential book, Valuing Environmental Resources. Or I should say, valuing environmental and natural resources. Doug Wrenn will be up second. He's an associate professor of environmental and resource economics, and he's the graduate program director of energy, environmental, and food economics, both in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education at Penn State University. He studies urban and land use economics and conducts non-market valuation research. Third on our list here is Amanda Weinstein from the University of Akron. She's an associate professor in the Department of Economics and the College of Business at the university there. She studies the factors that lead to economic success or decline of places. And most interestingly, she co-hosts the Suburban Women Problem podcast. I definitely invite everybody to go and listen to that. So today, I'm going to leave it up to our three speakers to go through their topics in order and chat with you about the sort of ideas they have on valuing environmental catastrophes. I'll kind of move them along from time to time. If they seem to be going a little bit long, try to keep everybody on time. And at the end, hopefully have some time for some good discussion. So without further ado, Dr. Haab.
Thanks, Wrenn. Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button there. Can everybody see the slides okay? Okay. Thanks, Brent, for organizing this, and thanks to Amanda and Doug for joining us here. What I'm going to talk about today is environmental catastrophes in the recreational economy, and I'm going to use an example from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It may seem a little bit odd to be talking about recreation when you're talking about environmental catastrophes, but it turns out that as an environmental economist, the recreational economy turns out to be really important for understanding and for valuing changes in environmental quality, and in particular when you have an environmental catastrophe trying to use the recreational economy to have better understanding of the change in value from people taking recreational trips. Sorry, trying to advance my own slide here. There it goes. So just to give you an idea of what the recreational economy looks like, the Bureau of Labor Statistics a few years back did a study trying to quantify the size of the recreational economy. And what they found was that the outdoor recreation economy in the U.S. accounted for about 1.9% of current gross domestic product in 2021. Just to give you an idea of what that means in terms of size, the farm economy and the full food economy, including all of agriculture and the domestic supply chain, ranges from about 0.7 to about 5.4%, depending on how broadly you define that economy. So just speaking broadly, the size of the recreational economy is roughly the size of the agricultural economy in the United States. And in that study, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also broke things down by state. And so you can see that on average, we're looking at about 2% of state GDP, with the more visited states for recreational purposes like Florida and the Mountain West and the Northeast having a much higher percentage of their gross domestic product is in the recreational economy. And it turns out that we can use information about changes in local recreation economies to estimate the effects of changes in well-being from environmental disasters. The idea here is that when an environmental disaster occurs, people change their recreational behavior. When they change that recreational behavior, what that means is that they're being made worse off. And if we can find ways to use the data on changes in recreational behavior, we're able to estimate the value of those changes and how much worse off people are made from those environmental disasters. One study that I had an opportunity to take part in was the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. And we're not talking about the movie being a catastrophe, but what we're talking about is, for those that remember back about a dozen years, in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon, a oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico, exploded. And during that explosion, the offshore oil drilling rig, the explosion killed 11 workers, but it also broke the well at the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And so for a period of about 87 days, from April 20th to July 15th, 2010, about 50,000 barrels of oil a day were spilling into the Gulf of Mexico from the seafloor, from the seabed. And until they were able to cap that well, the oil was spilling unimpeded. And just give you an idea of the scope of the oil spill and where where the impacted areas were. This is a map of the northern Gulf Coast that goes from about Louisiana over on the left side here, all the way around to about Pensacola, Florida. The white area was where observed oil at the surface was. And then there were other areas that were impacted along the way because the currents spill down the kind of the coast of Florida and head south, and then around the around Florida and then back up the East Coast. A lot of that oil stayed settled on the ocean floor, but a lot of the oil was coming to the surface. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, in their report on the Deepwater Horizon disaster, they came out with a statement that said that the Deepwater Horizon spill affected a broad array of linked resources and ecological services over a large area. The impact can best be described as an injury to the entire ecosystem of the northern Gulf of Mexico. It affected habitat at the coast, off the shore, and at the bottom of the Gulf. It affected species like fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, birds, and deep sea coral. And probably most important to what we're going to be talking about here today, it also affected our ability to go fishing, boating, and other recreation. So for those that recall what happened during that time, a lot of the coastal areas along the Gulf of Mexico were closed. Because it happened over almost the entire summer, that means an entire summer season was lost to recreation along the Gulf of Mexico. In order to help assess the damages that came from the oil spill, a group out of the University of Florida was hired by the state of Florida to take a look at what the estimated lost indirect and passive use economic values to Floridians was. This group ended up contracting a group of researchers from around the country that I was lucky enough to be a part of, along with a couple of other researchers that I've worked with a number of times in the past, including John Whitehead at Appalachian State University, John Loomis at Colorado State University, and a few others. And in that study, we were asked to try to assess the effects of the Deepwater Horizon spill on recreation in the northern Gulf of Mexico and Florida. So basically, roughly an area from around Tampa all the way around to up into the Panhandle. So what I want to talk about briefly before I get into some of the details of the actual study is what are those values that we're actually looking for, because it's really understanding those values that we're looking for that helps us to get a better idea of how we can apply these methods that we use in other cases of environmental disasters. So really, there's three types of values that we were looking at in terms of lost recreational value. The first one is one that most people are usually familiar with, and it's what we call economic impact. Economic impact is basically the dollar figures that you'll hear a lot of times in the news. A lot of times you'll hear it, you'll read it on websites, other things. These are the dollar figures that look like they're either lost revenues to regional economies, or their recovery costs. How much does it cost to clean up? How much does it cost to restore an area that's damaged by the environmental disaster? These are dollar figures that are fairly, I'm going to use the term easy to measure. They're not really that easy to measure, but they're easier to measure because they're basically accounting costs. They're costs that we can add up that, so we can think of things like lost hotel revenue, lost restaurant revenue. So lost revenue during the affected period, and then also the cost of recovery, the cleanup costs, those types of things. As an economist, though, those are not really the lost value from the environmental disaster, because something that comes up during these, when we're thinking about these economic impacts, is that one of the cons of that is you can actually have an increase in expenditures in the short term from these environmental impacts. So the economic impact can actually be positive in the short term, in the sense that suppose you have a hurricane that goes through an area. Well, there's going to be a recovery period, and during that recovery period, there's actually large increases in expenditures from the recovery. We have to rebuild areas. We have to, contractors will get more money. Builders will get more money. There'll be increases in demand for building supplies. There'll be increase in demand for infrastructure, those types of things. So it's actually possible that in the short run, when you look at an environmental disaster, expenditures will go up, and it'll look like the economic impact is actually positive because more money is actually coming into the local economy. Well, that's not really a loss. And we know that from these environmental disasters, people are damaged. There's damages that go along with these things. There's a decrease in well-being from these disasters, and we have to be able to quantify those disasters. So one thing that we refer to when we talk about economic impacts, and one thing we have to be careful of, is what we call the broken window fallacy. And the basic idea behind the broken window fallacies is that that disasters and the subsequent recovery can actually create a net benefit for society, but we shouldn't be viewing that as a positive thing. So we have to be really careful when we're thinking about economic impacts, that we're not really capturing these temporary increases in expenditures that are actually a negative rather than a positive. So what we're really looking for instead are what we refer to as lost recreational use value, and then lost passive or non-use value. The lost recreational use value is an estimate. We can estimate it from the demand for recreation trips to an area before and after the event. So we measure the number of trips that people are taking to the area. And then we measure after the fact the number of trips that are taken. And we look at that change in demand based on observed behavior to try to tease out from there the difference in the individual willingness to pay for those trips. So are the trips better or worse after the environmental disaster? Are they taking more or fewer trips? And we can use that to help us understand what the change in value is in the demand for recreation itself. One of the problems with using lost recreational use value is that it can take a long time and it can be expensive to estimate. These types of studies can cost well over $1 million, and they can take years to complete. Just to give you an idea, some of the work that we did on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is still coming out. Some of the research that's coming from those, some of the estimates of the damages. So almost a dozen years later, we're still trying to figure out what the total damages are from that event. The other issue that comes up is that the lost recreational use value, based only on people who were taking trips to that recreational site, doesn't capture what we call passive use values. Passive use values, or non-use values as they're sometimes called, are values that accrue to people, or damages that accrue to people who aren't necessarily taking a trip to the site. So one good example that you can think of here are things like endangered species. Suppose an endangered species is impacted by the event. So in the case of the Deepwater Horizon, not even an endangered species, but suppose dolphins are hurt. People really like dolphins. They like to know that dolphins aren't going to be hurt. They'd be willing to pay to prevent a similar event in the future. So there's actual damages that occur to people who aren't using the resource, but they have this passive value for it, or this non-use value. So the nice thing about the passive use values is it captures damages to people not directly affected from the loss of the resource. It's a more complete measure of total value. The problem with it is it actually it relies on recalling and opinion surveys to estimate the value. So it becomes more difficult to defend those types of values because people will say things on surveys, but then when actual money goes to change hands, sometimes that's different than what they say on surveys, and we have to be really careful about that. And so again, these types of studies can take a long time and be expensive to estimate. But really, when we're talking about the value from lost recreation, really what we're talking about is that decrease in well-being and how we value the decrease in well-being that results from the environmental disaster. So just to give you an idea of the size of the magnitude of the estimates from the Deepwater Horizon estimate, keep in mind this is only for the state of Florida. The study that we were doing was working with the state of Florida. The state of Florida was trying to decide whether or not to be included in the national lawsuit and the national damage assessment that was going to be used in lawsuits against Deepwater and BP at the time. Just to give you an idea of some of the difference in these things, and by the way, ultimately, Florida decided not to use these estimates on their own, but they decided to join with the federal lawsuit that came after this. The economic impact, those short-term accounting costs that rippled through the economy was about $1.3 billion. So it's a sizable sum. But if we look at the actual welfare losses, the actual loss in well-being and the valuation of that we did based on the lost trips that people took to the area over that summer period, and then also the passive use value that people had across the nation, in particular those east of the Mississippi, you can see when you add those together, you're at about $1.5 billion, and that's separate from the $1.3 billion economic impact. So these types of environmental disasters can have a sizable impact and can have a sizable, and the valuation of the loss of well-being can be sizable. So just real quick, some of the other applications we might be able to use for recreational valuations. Some of these are more local, some of these are worldwide. We've used these types of studies for harmful algal blooms, things like harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. We've done things for natural disasters, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. Climate change is going to be an interesting one moving forward. Climate change, changing water temperatures, changing tides, changing sea level increases in erosion, those types of things, changes in availability of water in various areas is going to change recreational opportunities. And as we have that increased variability in weather, due to climate change, you're going to see changes in recreational behavior. Things like snow melt and decreased snowpacks in the Rockies. They're going to decrease skiing opportunities. So there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of these recreational methods. And then things like toxic air and water pollution events. The recent train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. There's local areas where people would visit, and can we look at changes in visitation to get at some of those damages? I know I'm about to run out of time here, so just to wrap up real quick, just a couple of quick things to consider when there's an environmental catastrophe. First thing to consider is the timing. Solve the immediate problem. If you're involved in one of these areas, if you're working in one of these areas that has an environmental catastrophe, the most immediate concern is not to estimate the economic damages, because people real quick try to come up with a number and try to say these are the damages. Wait, give it some time. Damages take time to evolve and assess. The most important thing is to make sure everyone's safe, make sure that you have the resources to get through the acute impacts of the event, look at differential impacts. Are there different populations that are affected in different ways? Then you can start to think about those longer term effects. When you're looking at the longer term effects, look beyond the obvious effects. Are there decreased visits to nearby park? Are there unique resources that are affected? Do people outside of the area care about the resources too? And that's something like the endangered species. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Doug, and hopefully I didn't take up too much time there.
Thanks, Tim. Yep, Doug, over to you.
Second here, and I'll try to share my screen. Hope everybody can see it. Brent, assume you can. So,
Looks good.
okay. So yeah, I'm Doug Wrenn from Penn State, working in environmental economics. So today I'm going to talk about somewhat of a tee off of what Tim was talking about here in terms of valuation, but focusing specifically on the housing and the housing market and how large-scale environmental events, particularly catastrophes or improvements and past catastrophes, impact house prices. So to think about this just a little bit, what Tim was saying a minute ago is sort of put this in context. Housing's, it does a couple of things for us. It's obviously a widely traded product. People are very attuned to housing markets. It's also a large part of average household wealth in the United States. So prices go up and down, have a big impact both on the ability to consume, but also the potentially to retire and do other things in the future. So one thing to think about is how to think about housing is to put it in the context of what we call a model of characteristics or demand for characteristics. So we hear about markets for housing, we hear about markets for computers, we hear about markets for cars. But in most cases, these are products that we buy on a 0-1 basis and usually one at a time. If we buy a couple cars, it's usually very rare. And so we're thinking about demand in the extensive margin in a sense. We're thinking about buying something or not buying it. But what we're really interested in when we from an environmental perspective is the qualitative characteristics of these products. So you think about cars, whether they're EV or non-EV, whether they have certain level of horsepower or safety. So in housing is the same way. Housing is really made up of a lot of different factors, and it's these individual characteristics that if we have a large enough sample and we have some variation in time and otherwise, we can back out some of these values. So Tim was talking about potentially asking people about willingness to pay. In some senses, what we're going to do here is watch what happens in the housing market around changes in environmental outcomes, and then we're going to try to back out through some statistical methods and data on housing prices in order to figure out what things are worth. So I have a figure here that kind of hopefully just put this in context with both a cartoon and on the right-hand side tie this together. So if you think about a house price, and we're gonna use this what's called a hedonic method. It's widely used both in research but also in litigation and all sorts of other factors. So when you think about a house price, I would generally think about this as sort of made up of three parts. You've got the portion of the house that's made up of its structural characteristics, which are things that you could basically buy anywhere in any market. You can have certain numbers of bedrooms and toilets and things like that. Then you have local goods and services, which we'd like to control for, which might be school quality or things that your tax bases will buy you. And then for our purposes as environmental researchers, we're interested in how these amenities or disamenities from the environment increase or decrease house prices. So in the figure on the right-hand side, we have basically two examples of two houses. One of them is on the left-hand side in green, which I'm calling the high-priced house, but it also has high amenities, meaning that it's closer to the stream. It's not covered by this, high amounts of dirty soot coming out of these factories. And so we would expect its price to be higher. And then we have lower priced house in red, which we expect to be lower. Maybe it's further away from the stream. They share common characteristics, maybe the same school system, maybe similar build structures, but in general, they have variation in terms of environmental outcomes. And so this is precisely the type of variation that we capitalize in a lot of the literature that's been used in this methodology in order to figure out this question of, what would you be willing to pay, or what kind of discount would you be willing to take on a house for a better outcome, and what would you basically take in order to avoid these types of losses? And so what I'm going to talk about today is to go through a couple of examples that are focusing particularly on environmental disasters or catastrophes. So I saw one of the questions brought up the question of natural disasters versus, say, environmental disasters. I'm particularly going to focus today on a couple of examples that focus specifically on environmental disasters. As you may imagine, hedonic models, house price models have been used a lot to look at valuations around floods, hurricanes, fires, things like that. Obviously there's lots and lots of different ways we could go. We're going to focus today specifically on these E being something to do with like pollution or something in those regards. So I have 3 or 4 examples. I'm just going to go through, the time permitting, the couple that I think are the most relevant, and we can go from there. So probably one of the most relevant recent examples of a case where we have a large scale. And what I mean by large scale is not small changes, but something that has significantly changed the entire sort of housing market in a particular place and has had large negative effects, or we would expect large negative effects on people's willingness to pay to live in that particular area. So we would expect if you're going to live in an area that's had this, the prices of housing have to fall. And that was in Flint, Michigan. So some of you may be familiar with the with this environmental disaster. But this recent paper that came out in the American Economic Journal did a really nice job of sort of quantifying the effects of this. So in April of 2014, Flint, Michigan switched their water supply, their drinking water supply, from the Detroit system over to basically taking it back out of the Flint River, which they had done back in the 50s and 60s, and they fired up an old wastewater treatment facility plant and started basically running water through that. The city was also in financial receivership way before this point, as in 2011 during the financial crisis. And so they had a series of city managers, emergency managers in place that had basically unilateral authority to do whatever they wanted in the city. So around 2014, they made a decision to basically do this for a cost-saving method, and there was a lot of other administrative failures along the way. And so as a result of these decisions and using the relatively more corrosive water from the Flint River, you ended up basically causing a huge amounts of toxic lead contamination throughout all of the city system. So this is a full-scale market hit for the entire housing market in Flint, Michigan. And so about 17 months go by before the Virginia Tech report comes out and basically says, hey, we need to basically declare a public health emergency. We need to start basically telling people don't drink anything, and then start putting millions and millions of dollars into trying to replace these pipes, turn off the water from the Flint River, go back to Detroit, do all the things we have to do. So this represents a nice example, recent example of a truly large-scale environmental shock to an entire housing market. So they also provides a really nice graph in this paper to talk about this. So one question about how to handle this when we think about how to get these values, Tim was talking about survey work. So here we have an entire market that's been affected. So what we really need is a market that's kind of like Flint, Michigan, but it's not the same, but it's not exact, but hasn't had this effect. And so what the authors in this paper were able to do was to basically come up with these 3 cities in the United States that look similar in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, demographics, and other factors. They also have good housing data. Remember, we need data on actual housing transactions. We need lots of information about what's happening across time and across space. And so they picked out Youngstown, Ohio, Pontiac, Michigan, and Camden, New Jersey, where they had data on housing transactions starting as early as 2006 and going all the way up through August of 2019. And so what this figure on the left-hand side shows, we have housing prices on the left-hand side, but these are actually in percentage terms, which make it even more extreme. So the way to read this is the negative 0.2 is that this is a 20% drop in the average price of housing within Flint, Michigan, relative to what was happening before this before this water switch took place. So we can see that basically the financial crisis in 2011 didn't appear to have much of an effect. The switch itself started things down, but what really happened was right around the time of early 2015 and around the time the public health emergency prices just started to really decline. And so the overall impact, if you look at the results, takeaway, there's a lot of stuff in this paper, but the overall impact was that house prices fell somewhere between 26.9 and 38.5%, which represents about a $28,000 loss per house, which is a large amount relative to the relatively low valued houses in Flint, Michigan. The other thing we noticed about this, and I think Mana's going to talk about this a little bit later, is the trajectory here, at least out through 2019, doesn't look very good. A lot of times in environmental disasters like hurricanes and stuff, we see house prices bounce back pretty fast, at least in the relatively short term. Here, we're looking out, 4 or 5 years already, and house prices still seem to be severely dilapidated in Flint, Michigan, right around 30 or 40%, which is pretty unfortunate. The benefit cost analysis of this thinking about what Tim was talking about too, is that there was a huge amount of money spent, around $400 million remediating the crisis, which is necessary, but it doesn't appear, at least if you look at the overall total losses so far, that the money spent wasn't enough to overcome some of this large-scale loss that's happened. And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on. The one thing I will say about the housing market side of this is to keep in mind kind of what Tim was saying too, is that this is only a small part of the damages. In this particular case, especially with lead poisoning, these are only a really low bound estimate of all of the potential sort of economic well-being estimates associated with this. But at least from the housing market perspective, we get a snapshot into how bad this actually was for households in Flint, Michigan. The second example that I'm going to touch on has to do with sort of the opposite effect, and this is more common to hedonic and estimates, and that is something that was previously polluted was actually cleaned up. And so one of the areas where the U.S. government and local authorities spend a lot of money and have since the early 80s is in what are called Superfund sites. And these are particularly apt for places like in Pennsylvania and Ohio and a lot of the Rust Belt cities, because a lot of these old Superfund sites are old industrial sites that are considered to be extraordinarily dangerous. And so in 1980, Congress passed the Superfund Act with this long circular name, that basically set a tax on chemicals and took money from liabilities and basically set up this system of the national priorities list. And they did a hazard ranking score and then basically set out to clean these places up. And so most of these cleanup processes have multiple phases. You have a proposal phase, you have a listing phase, you have the construction complete phase, and then you have what's called deletion, which means technically, by the letter of the law, we're sort of back to where we started, or at least clean enough that people can start living near these places again without fear of health impacts. So this seems like an obvious example where the economics community and policy community could use housing across space and across time to kind of tease out how people are feeling about this. Because if you really do believe that the deletion of these sites from this list is as good as they were before, house prices should rise relative to the dirty time period before that. And so this has become a pretty popular area of analysis, using housing prices to both get at willingness to pay estimates, but also just to kind of get trends of this. And so I tried to find a good figure for this paper taking from this paper by Gamper, Robidron, and Timmons in 2013, but there wasn't a really great way to do this. So I'm going to just drew boxes around this to kind of give the takeaway points for this. And the one thing that we look at here is that it seems like the proposal and listing phase, sort of the expectation doesn't appear to be having much of an effect, but it does appear that, so basically the way this is these are house prices, basically the 10th percentile, the 20th or 30th, all the way up across the entire distribution. But looking around the bottom here in the deletion, we see that in general, the house prices appear to have risen roughly around 20%. So thinking about the fall in house prices from Flint, Michigan, at least in the case that this is a national level study of all of the cleanup sites that have happened as a part of the Superfund Act and the money spent on it, we see in general house prices have basically risen by about 20% on average at the median. We notice it's much bigger in the lower price houses, a little bit lower on the higher price houses, and then this bottom box down here basically shows sort of the dollar value. So the construction and the deletion positively seem to affect house prices. So this is the opposite effect of saying that we improve the environment, we get this higher willingness to pay to live near these opportunities. And we also see the percentage increase is higher for lower priced houses. The one additional thing to think about in this particular regard is the benefit cost side of this too, is whether it's worth it. So we saw in the Flint, Michigan case, there was a lot of money spent, but at least up until 2019, it doesn't appear that it's turning back the house prices in the opposite direction. In this particular case, the rough estimate takeaway for using the EPA's dollars spent on this for remedial action is that about 39 out of the 52 sites that were included as part of this study actually appear to show somewhat of a net positive benefit in terms of expenditures over at least using house prices as that final outcome. I'm going to skip this example and just go to the last slide just to give a couple more examples of other things that have worked out, so I can move on to let Amanda take her time. So one is brownfields. So there's been a lot of recent work done on this, as you may imagine. So Superfund sites are particularly toxic environments, but there's a lot of other sites around the United States that have a lot of negative contaminants associated with them, particularly. So there's roughly about 450,000 brownfield sites around the nation. There's been a program in place since 2002. It was an extension of the Superfund Act that has a grant program that basically people can compete for grants to clean these places up. And there's many papers that have been done on this as well, but the rough estimates that is the housing prices around these places post cleanup and once they're basically put back to normal, rise by about 5 to 15%. There's also some evidence that it's bigger in places that have higher priced areas and homes relative to lower priced areas. So there's a great deal of heterogeneity. And then there's the second one is these leaking underground storage tanks that are part of gas stations and old facilities and stuff like that. And these also seem to show, fairly large increases. So the takeaway is that house prices and housing price markets give us a great sort of a view into backing out these values or the characteristics associated with environment. They allow us to turn changes in prices into monetary values that approximate for economic welfare. They're not exact measures of welfare only under certain conditions, but they allow us to think about what people are willing to pay. And they also allow us to then compare those sort of gains and losses to the overall expenditures that we're going to use in order to clean them up, to think about where we should target our funds, how should we think about improving the environment. So,
Doug, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Amanda.
All right, thanks, Doug and Tim. That was a great tee up, and I will try and wrap things up for us. There we go. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint now. So Tim did a great job of talking about, all the different ways that we value damages. So if you look at what's happening in East Palestine, we already have initial estimates of damages. So we have the cost of cleanup. We have, how much is estimated that we're going to have to pay residents and companies and local government to deal with that economic impact. So if you read the book, The Lorax, when you were a kid, that I think most of us did, what the Lorax got kind of really right is when private incentives that incentivize overuse of something, when they don't allow with social incentives to conserve something, so the environment, for example, what we get is markets that fail to allocate us and get us to a place where our economy is as big as it possibly can. We're at an inefficient point. So when companies take more risks, especially when they don't pay the full cost of the risks that they're taking, then what we get to is a place where we have disasters that maybe shouldn't have happened, or companies taking risks that we don't want them to take. So it's really important to estimate the full cost of an environmental catastrophe and what it really does cost our economy. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit because I'm in Northeast Ohio and talk about the Cuyahoga River. So the Cuyahoga River in 1969, everyone knew was polluted. It was no secret. So this is a picture of a plain dealer reporter dipping his hand into the river, and that's what came out. But many people thought that pollution meant that, industry was thriving and our economy was booming. It was just kind of this trade-off that we kind of accepted to have our economy, keep chugging along. So what inevitably happened, or as we know happened, is eventually a train went by and sparked fire to the river that was filled with debris and oil and a number of things. And it just so happened that a Time magazine reporter was there and happened to see this river on fire. And this, the reporter's like, "Oh my gosh, your river's on fire." And we're like, I know it happens sometimes. It happened, a dozen other times. So the picture we have of the fire was actually of a different fire in the 1950s. But they used this picture in Time magazine to talk about how the Cuyahoga River was on fire and that this was a river that oozed rather than flow, right? So now think about what that puts in your mind when you think about a place where the rivers ooze rather than flow, right? At the time, Representative Lewis Stokes said, "Man, this makes us look bad." Right. So here he's not talking about the cost of cleanup. He's not talking about fish and river otters. He's just saying, man, this really makes us look bad. And I like to have this quote in here because I don't think he gets enough credit for how important that was for the long run economic impact of something like the Cuyahoga River fire. So since the river fire in 1969, Northeast Ohio has made tremendous changes. Some credit it with spurring the environmental movement. Some credit it with EPA regulations to control point source pollution. With the national park that we now have, even river otters, aren't they so cute? But those river otters are a huge kind of check to see how healthy our rivers are. All very important changes that have happened since 1969, right? So in our past, right? That's a long time ago, right? But every time we have kind of national attention on Cleveland, whether it's for our NBA championships or a Republican National Convention or a World Series, I like to pay attention to how people talk about Cleveland. And at each of these three things, I noticed, and other people did too, reporters somewhere still talked about our river that caught fire in 1969, right? So when we think about the damages of something, right, when the damages happen to a place, and that place has people there, and when it really changes how we think about living in that place, those impacts can be very long-term. So if you look at population, right, do people want to live in these places? So here I'm just doing a basic comparison of Cleveland to Cincinnati, right? And you can see very different paths of two industrial cities, before and after the river fire. It really changed how people saw, especially Cleveland, not just Cleveland, but I would also say probably a broader region and what we thought about the industrial Midwest. So it wasn't just how other people thought about us, but it was also how we thought about ourselves. So this is a quote from a book. I don't want to call it the book or the person, but I will just say this is a quote from a book about Akron, actually. And this is from a photographer in Northeast Ohio. And this photographer said Northeast Ohio doesn't have the luxury of a geographical crown jewel. There is no ocean or mountain range, no grand desert or majestic vistas really to speak of. We have no geographical crown jewel in Northeast Ohio, right? Clearly juxtaposed against the picture of Lake Erie, right? We do have a geographical crown jewel, but I don't like to name the person that said this because they're not alone in thinking this, right? This river fire changed not only the way other people look at us, but the way we look at us and the way we invest our resources in places or don't invest our resources in places. So why is he talking about a geographical crown jewel? Geographical crown jewels tend to matter. This is a map of looking at population across the US. If we look at where populations are going, what you can see is, in those blue areas, we see, probably people like beaches and people like mountains. Those geographical crown jewels, they matter. People are moving to those places. So Doug did a great job of talking about these hedonic studies and how we use housing prices to estimate how people view about location. So if you bought a home, every real estate agent's 3 favorite words are location, 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 right? These home values reveal preferences for these locations and what these locations have to offer. So if we see home values decrease because of water quality, as we've seen in previous studies, or air quality, or Doug also talked about, in Flint, Michigan, right? That's concerning. It's telling us these are locations people don't prefer. People don't want to live there. It's not that Northeast Ohio doesn't have a geographical crown jewel. We have Lake Erie. I just showed you a picture of it. We have a lot of geographical crown jewels in Ohio. But where natural amenities are associated with higher population growth in counties across the US, natural amenities are associated with lower population growth in Ohio. It's not that we don't have natural amenities, it's that we don't invest in them the same way other areas have invested in their natural amenities. Natural amenities alone don't guarantee us population growth. They are not a sufficient condition to guarantee us economic growth. We have to capitalize on those assets to really see the economic benefits. And when something happens, like a river fire or natural environmental disaster, that really takes away from us being able to capitalize on those natural amenities, where we see it has a really important impact for economic growth. So when we see lower home values in Flint, Michigan, or we see lower home values near environmental hazards or Superfund sites, or places where the air quality is worse, what that tells us is people don't like to live there. There's something about that location, the environmental hazards, the air quality, that people don't like. So when we see those home values lower, it also tells us something about this general idea about quality of life, right? Quality of life is basically places that offer higher quality of life are locations people want to be. Places that offer lower quality of life are places people don't want to be. And home values are one way we can measure the quality of life in that area. So when we see lower home values in an area around Superfund sites, or when around Flint, Michigan, it tells us this area is offering people a lower quality of life. Why does that matter? So this is previous research I've done with my co-authors at Ball State, Mike Hicks and Emily Wrenn, as well as John Austin. When we look at the relationship between estimated quality of life and population growth, we see that higher estimated quality of life is associated with higher population growth. People want to be there. Higher job growth, the jobs go to the people. Also more business startups. This is especially true in small towns like East Palestine. It's also especially true for the Midwest. So these graphs that you see here are looking at just small towns in the Midwest. The higher their estimated quality of life, the better they do on job growth and population growth. And we find it's especially true in the wake of the pandemic. So these scatter plots are looking at pre-pandemic. So our initial results post-pandemic is that it's even more important post-pandemic. Why? More people can work remotely. That quality of that location, the quality of life that location offers, is increasingly important. So if you look at, this is a quote from The Economist I took recently. Mayors are shifting their focus from attracting firms to attracting residents by improving quality of life, right? So this is a big shift from what we saw in the 1950s and 1960s in Cleveland, right? So there it was really all about what can we allow firms to do? It's all about how do we attract firms and lower costs for firms, and what can we give to firms so that we bring these firms and jobs here, and this is what's going to grow our economy. But since then, there has been this kind of evolution of quality of life taking increasing importance. What matters is, do you have that place where people want to be? And then you get the firms that follow. So if you look at over time, what you had is, even when the river fire happened, we had rising incomes in Cleveland, and people were already concerned about industrial waste even at that time. And the city tried to do something about it before the fire happened. But the problem is at that time, state laws prevented local efforts from cleaning it. They basically had already determined that this river was industrial and would continue to be industrial no matter what Cleveland wanted it to be, right? So, and then you get the river fire. So generally what we see is, as incomes increase, the environment tends to get worse. So this is this kind of hill we see. And at some point when incomes increase, people want nicer places to live. We don't want rivers that catch on fire, right? We want rivers that we can kayak in. And what we see is a continuance of incomes increasing demand for nice places, demand to live in those nice places, which really puts increasing importance on making sure we have these places that people can regularly, go to recreate in, to kayak, to fish, all of those things that Tim was talking about. So we have seen a big change from where seeing a polluted river, right, and industrial accidents is no longer a sign of a dynamic economy for people. People don't see that and look away and think, well, at least we have jobs. We see the opposite. When we see polluted rivers, we don't see a dynamic economy. We see what we have been branded with as the Rust Belt. So in 2016, you had a very, I think, well-intentioned organization shared a video on YouTube where they went down to the Cuyahoga River and they tried to light it on fire. It did not light on fire. And this was, I think, supposed to be this, look, our rivers don't catch on fire anymore in 2016. Right. The problem is just the river not catching on fire anymore isn't enough. Right. When we talk about the damages caused by some type of environmental catastrophe, just the cleanup isn't the full economic impact. Right. It's really more about this long run impact and how people respond and associate this environmental disaster with that place. Right. The Cuyahoga River Fire was very much about that place and how we viewed living in that place. So if the East Palestine accident gets tied to East Palestine and how people there and nearby view living in that place, we should expect a long run impact from that disaster, similar to what Doug showed with Flint, Michigan. All right, so that was it. And we can get to questions now.
That was great. Thanks a lot, Amanda. And thanks, Tim and Doug. Let's get everybody back on the video, assuming your videos work. Thanks. Fantastic. I think there's a lot there for discussion, and we did get a few questions. Let me start with one of them. I thought I'd start, I'm going to start right at the end here, Amanda, since you kind of teed it up with that last point. And it was something I was really thinking about when I saw your graph between Cincinnati and Cleveland, and being a proud Cincinnatian. And of course, I was really happy to see that slide. But you kind of made mention of this. I mean, it's between 1969 and 2023, that's 54 years, and the trends hasn't changed, right? The trend difference between the two hasn't changed so much. I mean, is that literally where East Palestine is headed? I mean, it's where are we with that? I mean, Doug sort of showed a short-term thing for East Lansing, but we're only a few years out from that anyways, right? So I don't know, where are we? I'd like all three of you to sort of comment on that.
I don't know if it will be as severe, but I do think it will have that long run impact like the river fire, especially because this made national news. Everyone knows East Palestine, where if you would have asked someone 5 years ago, have you heard of East Palestine? I've never heard of that. Now a lot of people have heard about it, and for not a great reason. So I would say we hired a new faculty member recently, and it's always interesting to see how faculty or potential faculty members from outside Ohio view Ohio. And it's kind of a fun, like, oh, what do you think? Here's Ohio. And sometimes we get the like, oh, I envisioned more cows. Like, this is just what we get sometimes. But he was like, oh, I'm pleasantly surprised. And I was like, oh, great. Tell me more. Why are you pleasantly surprised? And he said, oh man, I kind of thought this whole area was just factories and like burning rivers, essentially. Like today, in today's time period, that was the viewpoint of all of Northeast Ohio, right? It is kind of seared in our brains. And it's not just from people outside Ohio, right? It's people in Ohio have this seared in our brains. We have really failed to make investments on Lake Erie and a number of our natural resources because we still kind of have this view of, you know, we screwed it up a long time ago. And if history is a guide, I'm not sure that we are ready to make the real investments in East Palestine to really overcome what happened there and to change how this area has now been branded.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think there's some trade-offs that go along with all of this. Ohio does have natural amenities, but it doesn't necessarily have the reputation for that, but it also doesn't have the magnitude of the natural amenities other places have. That you know, Florida is a destination. It's a place that people go to visit. It's not just about living there, but it's also that sort of tourist economy, those other reasons to go there. And so I think part of that gives you a reason to reinvest, because when people come to visit you, that's new money into the economy. That's new money coming from outside the economy into the economy. So that tourist economy, it kind of gives an incentive for that increased investment in the short run, and the recovery investment. So with the with Deepwater Horizon, even though we're 12 years out and there are some things they're still trying to recover, it's largely recovered, and the visitation rates are back up. So those impacts are shorter term. But I agree, when we're looking at places that are livable, but not necessarily those tourist destinations, you're going to have these sort of wide swings that are hard to recover from.
Oh, 100%. And just going off what Tim said, and I caution divulging this, but I used to watch The Bachelorette a lot. And on The Bachelor one season, they came to Cleveland. And watching, if you have a chance, watch this 1-minute clip of when they announced to the Bachelorettes that they'll be coming to Cleveland to visit, right? To learn about Cleveland and visit all the sites. They aired at least 30 seconds of dead air time when those ladies found out they were coming to Cleveland. They were not excited. And when they aired, even when they got to Cleveland, and like, I think some were like, oh my God, there's a lake. Who knew? Who knew it had a lake, right? That's not good, right? If we're not even thought about at all for recreation, it's not a good sign for the future. And we saw this year, Ohio lost population for the first time, I think ever in decades. That's not a good sign for the future health of our economy. We should have people who so I'm not from Ohio, and I love Ohio though, but the hardest thing I have is convincing my family members that I really love Ohio. And I take my family to lakes and I take them hiking to see waterfalls, and every single one is shocked by what Ohio has, right? This is a big missed opportunity that Ohio has.
The one thing I would add to what you're saying about the housing, so one thing that stuck out. So partially the discussion on housing, I think, so sometimes we're not more large change. I was going to say earlier, it's hard to say this in 12 or 15 minutes. Is that it's hard to, I think, the effects that you get from traditional sort of housing hedonics, or these sort of what we call reduced form models, are pretty local effects. I think probably to explain that sort of longer run trajectory, you'd have to combine it with some of the population changes and think more about sort of inter-location sorting. So and so thinking about that a little bit, I think, falling house prices can actually be good for people who remain behind if house prices were relatively higher before, right? Because you can get this sort of real wage bump for people that remain behind. So there was a recent paper by Matthew Nottawadigdo at Chicago, who kind of looked at the high skilled, low skilled exoduses before and after negative economic shocks. And the takeaway was that some places that have, as you have these negative shocks, your higher income folks might leave. which, put downward pressure on housing price demand, which lowers prices. So actually real wages could actually rise for people that are left behind, and you could have a sort of lower population at a different equilibrium. And then in the case of like, say, East Palestine, or say with Flint, you have massive influxes of government money for not just the years right afterwards, but for sometimes decades afterwards, to kind of prop up like lots of different things. So you could have social services and things like that. And I think they can have really long run sort of unpredictably dynamic effects on what the economy looks like, 5-10 years out. So I'm not sure if there's a good way to put a finger on that. Population could fall, but you could be back. The other part of this is with housing is that Ed Glazier at Harvard wrote a paper on this back about 15 years ago about, housing is a fixed, it's a non-destructible resource. So when you have a negative shock, prices fall much faster, right? Because you can't really remove, if you have a new equilibrium where populations are smaller than they were before, prices can fall and stay low for a very long time because you have this excess supply of housing that nobody really wants. So you think about Detroit or places like that, or even Cleveland for that matter, from the 60s to 2000. And so it's long run depression on houses, prices could last for a really long time. And so I don't know if I could predict this for Flint or anyone else, but there's evidence that in these old industrial cities it has happened before.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, so part of, what he's talking about there is it can lead to a poverty trap where people get in poverty and stay in poverty and kind of stuck in poverty in these areas.
Yeah. So, well, I don't think there's any other way to say it. It sounds like essentially this group is reasonably not optimistic related to, say, our example right now in Ohio of East Palestine, that house prices are more than likely diminished there, potentially by a lot, and that there's a long road to move those house prices back up. It will be better if the population doesn't decline, but there's also a chance of some population decline, which could create an even bigger problem in the long run. It could create some benefits for some folks who stay behind, as Doug points out, but probably the estimate would be a negative impact, and it would be a long run thing.
Yeah, and it doesn't even include sort of expectations, right? Of what you think was, because if it's an asset, like we were saying, a lot of people invest in housing for their assets and stuff like that. And we've seen this with shale gas, where there's never been really a systematic evidence of pollution, but the expectations themselves have been able to depress house prices by 15 to 20%. So.
Well, it's fascinating. I don't know if it's for folks who are listening in. I guess what I found is that these all are economists with one arm, because no one's arguing the other side of this. So that's not a bad thing, actually. The economists are kind of centralized around the same sort of idea of what might happen there, even though it's not a positive story necessarily, at least for that particular place. On the other hand, Doug, I thought I saw, and I'm going to go to these questions online here in a second, but I wanted to follow up with one thing. In the numbers you showed some places where we can actually increase prices, right? So that actually by cleaning things up, it actually does make a big difference for house values in certain circumstances. So actually there is some hope that if those expenditures can be spent well, and I just saw some evidence from OSU actually, and it was in the newspaper today, that there actually aren't any impacts on plants. I haven't found any of the negative things. So they've done a lot of tissue testing in plants, that is agricultural crops in the area. So there's no long-term, well, it doesn't look like there's any negative impact on the plants that are growing this year of the chemicals that were either put into the atmosphere, into the water system. So, I mean, there could be some positive things of the cleanup if it works, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, this is obviously we've all probably read these papers. It's been a pretty hotly debated topic since the Superfund Act was passed, which is probably the best example of cleaning up particularly dangerous locations that have populations living near them. And the early evidence was sort of benign. I think but it was hard to test these hypotheses because a lot of times all we had was sort of aggregated data at the census tract level with median prices that were, sort of assessed values. And more recent work that's been able to use like actual housing transactions connected to these locations, it's actually found that there is positive effects after things is completely cleaned up and revitalized. Now, the other thing about this too is a lot of this evidence is pretty localized. Like the Flint, Michigan example was like pretty egregious. I mean, that's a whole water system that fell. But in the case of like the brownfields and in the case of Superfund sites, it really does tend to be pretty localized, like within about a kilometer or so. So, depending on what we're talking about, I mean, it could be the case that like East Palestine is probably in no way like Flint, Michigan in the sense that it completely completely destroyed an entire water system in an entire urban area. So it's likely that maybe that it could be localized and might not have a sort of a broader effect. So I don't know that for sure. So.
Yeah, just following up on that real quick, and two of the questions here have similar themes to that. And there's there's one question about whether trees matter and can we identify the effect of trees on housing values, and then there's one about school districts and school district effect on housing values. One thing to note in most of these studies, including the recreation ones, the housing ones, we try to control for all those other things. We try to take out the effects of all those other things. So when we say the direct impact of an environmental catastrophe, we're controlling for a lot of those other factors that affect housing values, affect recreation values, all those other things. Doug, one of the questions asks if there's evidence out there about trees and the effect of trees on housing values. I know there's a lot on open space. I don't know if there's a lot on trees specifically.
Yeah, I was actually. Funny thing, there actually was a paper back in July of 2022. It was a meta-analysis, which I didn't even know there'd been enough studies. Meta-analysis is a fancy word for a study of studies. I didn't actually know there'd been enough tree studies to have a meta-analysis, but there has been. It was in ecological economics, and takeaway is that it's pretty mixed. If they're on your property and falling on your house, they tend to be negative. If they're out in the street away from you, like in a park, they're positive. So I was just scouring the paper and looking at the results, and it's yeah, I think it's not conclusive. I mean, generally positive, but not really large. So I'm not sure if that helps answer your question. I'm happy to follow up with the question was from Elizabeth, I think, right? Yeah, if you're happy to shoot me an email or to Brent, he can copy me or whatever. I'm happy to talk about it more. I can provide you with other stuff. I just haven't had a chance to look at this, but it does seem like that there's some pretty recent work on that I could point in that direction. So.
I can talk about school values too. So one of the most consistent things we find that impacts quality of life is the school quality and how much you're spending on our local schools. And one thing we know, when you have something like an environmental disaster and you lose this kind of what we call physical capital, right? You've lost or you've degraded the assets that your community has, the natural assets. So you can clean it up. You can make those natural assets better. You can add more parks or something else to give them more natural assets. You can also invest in other forms of capital. So one of those might be a human capital or your schools. So one way that we could potentially think about making up for what's happened in East Palestine and some of these places in Cleveland is really investing in schools, which really seems to matter a lot for quality of life. And so one thing, because of how we typically fund schools, is through housing property values. So if your housing values go down, that also means your schooling, you could potentially have the same number of people there, but less money going to the schools as the housing property values go down. So this is also concerning for schools just because of how we typically fund schools.
One I was scouring the questions too, because I don't want to leave too many people behind. The one question was Doug able to bring in home buyer demographics, especially race, into the analysis of changing home prices? So this is a challenging question to answer, because the way that most of these analyses that I presented are done is really looking at the change of a house, usually over time, sometimes space, but sometimes space and time. So for either a group of houses, and a lot of times we're not able to. Well, most of the time, we're actually not able to actually track who is actually in the house before and after. And that's really what we would need to do a comprehensive sort of what we call welfare analysis that Tim was talking about. Because if you think about, say, cleaning up a natural disaster site like a Superfund site, you could actually end up in a situation where poor households are pushed out of those homes. So maybe it's not particularly detrimental before that. Maybe it's dangerous, but they're fully aware of the risk and they live there and they have a relatively cheaper home. And now you clean it up and you have this gentrification and people are forced out. And actually you could end up in a situation where they may be forced to the next dirtiest location and wealthier people live in those locations. So the answer is that in order to get at that question, we really need to go into a more, what we call structural world, where we can basically tie the actual household's location choices across time. And that's as most people on this call will attest to, is a pretty challenging thing to do, both data limitations and just estimation. Yeah, so hopefully that helps out. So the answer is a lot of these just aren't able to actually get at the actual demographics, right? In this particular context. So we had another webinar, we could probably talk a little more about that. There is work out there, but the second question after that, I think, was the panelists researched the impact of wildfires in California. So actually, ironically, currently with another colleague here at Penn State, we have a really large Department of Energy grant that's focused a good bit on wildfire risk across different vectors in California. Compared to say flood risk or hurricanes, fire risk is a relatively new recent phenomenon being studied, just because the damages and the size of the wildfires have really grown in the last probably 5 or 10 years. But the answer is that at least in terms of home prices and things like that and location choices, it's not entirely clear that wildfires have had a massive effect as of yet. Probably the single biggest negative effect on terms of overall economic and human well-being has been the impact of the smoke from wildfires. That's probably been the biggest. But yeah, there's actually, this is a pretty rapidly growing area of research, so it's probably not can't really do it justice in the short amount of time we have on this call. But
Yeah, that's interesting about the wildfires is because there maybe are more of them, but it's also the fact that more people live closer to places where wildfires happen in the West, because those are really nice places to live, right?
I was to say the amenity values, I think, what is it, the WUI, the wildland urban interface, is the single fastest growing land use type in the United States over the last 15 years. So yeah, like you said, Amanda's amenities, people are moving to Colorado and right up into the mountains, and there's just
So let me ask about that though. So I want to go back to the recreational stuff, because what I find fascinating in the economics is that we spend, well, house values are huge, right? There's a big chunk of many of our, well, anyone who owns a home, it's a big chunk of your assets probably, right? And it's an important component of, well, we spend a lot of time in our homes, but we also spend a lot of time in leisure, right? And we maybe spent more time in leisure in the last 5 years than we ever spent before, just because of what happened with the pandemic. So, I mean, but all of the recreational numbers always seem smaller than the housing value numbers. When you aggregate them up and put them together, they just always seem lower. I mean, I'm just amazed that a elimination of beach going during an entire summer is worth $693 million and not $14.5 billion, I guess. You know, I just, so give me some scale numbers here. Are we underestimating recreation? I mean, in a sense, Amanda, you're kind of talking about recreation. That's what drives people into or out of a place in a sense. The houses don't really matter. They just come along with it, right? Of course, you want a nice house, but this kind of comes along with the fact that you want to live in this place that has all these nice amenities in which you can recreate. I feel like we're underestimating recreation somehow. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And part of it is the methods we use. In the Florida case, we were stunned that it was as small as it was. And one of the big reasons was people just went to the East Coast. So we surveyed people on where they went instead of going to the Gulf Coast, and they just drove the opposite way in Florida. Or if you're coming from Ohio, the difference between going to Destin or going to Jacksonville is not that big in terms of cost, in terms of distance, all of those, time, the other things, all the things that go into that price of recreation. And so you don't get those huge effects in the case where there's a lot of substitutes. And so I think part of what happens with recreation is people just substitute away from recreation. They substitute to the next best alternative. They don't go to the outdoor amenities. They buy more movies. They buy more, they're doing things inside, those types of things. And so I think there's just a lot of substitutes there. And so I think we are missing some of that direct effect of these impacts, because people just change their leisure behavior. So recreation's a luxury good. It's something you do in your spare time. It's not something you have to do. And so how we capture those values, I think, is something that we really need to think about, especially at the aggregate level. The other thing to keep in mind with that number there, that was only for Florida and only for the Florida beaches. So it didn't account for Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana. So there are a lot of other numbers that were in there that we weren't able to capture.
So we had we've had some, so you guys are all great economists. We've got a number of other economists on here. So have we just over included the value of substitution and recreation and ignored it with houses? Or does it just come back to the fact that a house is a fixed asset that you can't sell very easily, and recreation is something you can pretty easily shift from one place to another? Is that just what the reason why it's relatively less valuable in a sense?
I also think when you look at housing, like recreation is super important to housing, right? If we think about Americans, we like access. We like access right now when we want it, right? Like, I go to McDonald's many times. Why? Because I get a burger right then for my kids, right? So I think recreation is similar. We increasingly want recreation where we live, right here. So I think that when you look at the housing values, it's absolutely part of that is recreation. And do we have access to recreation all the time? And if you look at where we're spending our time, if you look at time use surveys show that we're increasingly spending, more minutes each day in recreation. And we were doing it even before the pandemic. The pandemic just kind of, changed our time use a little bit. But when you have places that are good to visit and that are great for recreation, they're also great places to live because people have ready access to that recreation whenever they want it, right? So when you have places that aren't great to visit or people don't view it that way, they might also likely be places that aren't as great places where people want to live, where they have easy access to recreation any weekend, any time of day to go hiking, to go do what they want. And so I think you also have the two kind of build on each other in a way that, pure recreation might not capture it, but the housing values can capture some of, the value of recreation, of having ready access to it all the time.
I wonder too about, I was trying to think of an example that would fit, like the combination of like the house, because a lot of the hedonic papers, like I was thinking about water quality as an example, like along, say, the lakes, Erie or whatnot. And there was a recent paper by Sheil Olmsted and some co-authors that combined the idea of a recreational demand model with a hedonic model. And the idea of that was like, you sort to Tampa, but not just because you don't live on the water doesn't mean you're not in Tampa for the recreation benefits. And so when you put those two things together, that you sort of sort into Tampa and pay a higher housing price relative to non-Tampa, but you just don't live right on the Tampa Bay, you're still buying the rights to go down to Tampa Bay on a regular basis and go fishing. And then they combine, right? And anyway, when they put those two together, the numbers get much, much larger than either one of those two things separately. So it could be that just, some combination of conditional sorting afterwards, or is, ends up raising these values. And this was a before and after the TMDL cleanup around the Tampa Bay, which was another big sort of change in environmental values.
So we haven't talked much about the passive use values. So just a final, I guess, question here. The numbers for those are bigger, they're harder to estimate. I mean, it's funner, I think, for most of us to talk about real numbers that come out of actual behavioral things, right? Like recreational changes or housing value changes, right? It's easier to talk about those, but these passive use values are pretty important, right? They do drive a lot of stuff. I mean, are we missing something by not spending more time talking about that and using those methods? I mean, are we missing anything? I guess that's my question. And I guess one of the questions here is like, that they seem underestimated, but policymakers have a tough time taking them seriously, right? What do we do about that? Tim, you spent a lot of time in this.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's Tim. This is Tim's question.
They're legally admissible in damage cases, but they have to be defensible. And for those that aren't overly familiar with that, I did downplay some of that they just because didn't want to get into a big debate over use and non-use value. But in cases of non-use value, you're asking hypothetical questions, and you're asking people to put themselves into situations they're not familiar with. If you ask somebody in a market situation, how much are you willing to pay for something, they understand what that number is. They have some reference points. They know they can kind of get an idea of what that is. If you put them in an unfamiliar situation, it's much harder for them to answer the question. So how much would you be willing to pay to prevent another oil spill like the Deepwater Horizon? How much would you be willing to pay to prevent another train derailment in a small town in Ohio? Those are situations that don't come up in your mind, and trying to wrap your head around what that number means and make it defensible, because you don't really have the comparison number to go along with that. And so we spend a lot of time on the survey methods, making sure the surveys are defensible, making sure the methods are defensible to be able to get to those numbers. But then a lot of times people, I was listening to a podcast the other day, it was among economists, and they came out, it was a Freakonomics podcast, and the host came out and said economists don't like hypothetical situations. They only like to use observable data. And I threw my hands up, spent my whole career trying to figure out what these things are. And we can't even convince our own that these things have value. But you know, I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that, you know, people value endangered species even if they never see them. And so when a species goes extinct, that's a damage, and there's a value to that. And so how do we assess that value and then add that up to better put it on comparable grounds with things that we do know how to value? The other piece of that is that people like to look at dollar figures and try to interpret them as well-being. They're not the same thing. So being able to understand what welfare is or what well-being is versus economic impacts, you know, we can make GDP grow. We can put that as a target, but that doesn't mean people are necessarily getting better, being made better off. Amanda brought up a great example of Cleveland. You know, there was a lot of growth in Cleveland from manufacturing. Does that mean people were being made better off along the way if it's at the expense of things that don't have market values? And so those things need to be accounted for. And there's been a lot of progress over the last, we'll say 40 years in trying to get these values to be acceptable. But yeah, they're not, it's not straightforward to make them acceptable. But yes, Brent, the answer to your question is yes, we're way undervaluing nature. We're way undervaluing environmental goods and services because they just don't fit into that economic model of gross domestic product.
Tim, I know we have kind of one question, just as a follow-up. I'm following up on Tim's too. Do you think, I mean, thinking about government money and funding and whatnot, I mean, is there a case to be made that it's a lack of information and we could do more of it? Should we do more of it? I mean, think about like national accounts to, you know, sort of bolster GDP with green GDP. I mean, what do you think? I mean,
yeah, and that's actually where that the BLS report that I was talking about on the value of recreation, that's where that's coming from, is how do we start to incorporate some of these things on comparable grounds to gross domestic product.
And I would also say, like with the passive use, the example I gave of the photographer in Northeast Ohio that couldn't remember we had a Great Lake. I mean, that's kind of a great example. Like the lake is there, but in many people's minds, how we treated the lake in the past took it from existence, that it is something there and that it is an asset. I mean, reality is it's there. But what that event did is it did take it from a lot of people's minds of realizing that that is an asset we have.
Well, we've gone through our time. I really appreciate all three of you joining us today and talking about these issues. They're hard to grapple with. They're interesting to economists, hopefully to others as well. They're useful to many people. And I do think you guys did a great job of illuminating both the methods as well as the importance of the methods in how we think about, you know, this question of not just valuing, I guess, environmental catastrophes, which is where we started, but just valuing the environment and its impact on our lives. I think it's important. We got to keep doing work on it. So thank you. For those who are still with us, this is recorded and we'll send everyone a link to the recording. Feel free to have a look again if you want, or share it with others who you might think would get something out of it. Thanks a lot. Okay, guys, thanks a ton.
Thank you.
We'll send you the link as soon as we have her all set up. Thanks, Miles. I should have appreciated you.
Thanks,
too.
Miles.
Thanks for helping out.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Miles, you got that recording?
Yep. Hey, sorry, my Wi-Fi went out, but
No worries. All right. Thanks a lot for everything. All right. We'll catch up with you later.
catch up. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye.